Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to everyone joining in with us this evening. Tonight, I'm really thrilled to be joined by Dr Kathryn Milligan to speak about her brand new publication, Painting Dublin 1886 to 1949, Visualising A Changing City. Obviously, Dublin is a subject very close to our hearts here in the Little Museum. So, Kathryn, really entirely thrilled to have you here. So, thank you so much for taking the time.
No, thank you so much for having me, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks a million. And I understand you had an online launch event today out in UCD to officially mark the beginning. How's the day been going for you?
Yeah, it's been very emotional and very overwhelming. I did my undergraduate degree in UCD and then went back there to finish writing the book. And I suppose just to see everyone, even on Zoom, after not seeing them really all year, to hear some really wonderful things being said about the book, it was really wonderful, a really wonderful day.
Wonderful. I think that's it sounds gorgeous. I think seeing familiar faces and kind of people that you've, I guess, been perhaps distant from in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
I love your Christmas tree, just let it be said.
Oh, thank you. This is the closest we're getting to a Christmas party this year. So
yeah, I like it. You're embracing it. It's but I kind of, so I'm going to just jump straight into the book, and I've got about, I think I have about 100 questions for you. So we're going to jump in how we get on. Of course, everyone joining us this evening, if anyone has a question for Kathryn, please do type them in and we'll very happily make our way through them over the course of the evening. But my first question to you is kind of looking at the span of time that you cover within the book. We obviously go through quite radical and substantial change in Dublin City and in Dublin during that time. And I guess I'd love you just to start by telling us the artists that you're addressing in the book and maybe contextualizing the times that they're living in.
Yes, absolutely. So let's start with the artists themselves, maybe, because they are at the heart of it. So the book looks at 6 different artists who were either born in Dublin or ended up in Dublin. So Dubliners by both birth and adoption. So in chronological order, they are Walter Osborne, I'm trying to get Rose Barton, Jack B. Yeats, Harry Kernoff, Estella Solomons, and Flora Mitchell. So some artists that I think will be familiar, hopefully, to some people who are listening in, and then maybe who are, not as familiar. But all are reasonably well kind of represented in many of the publications or public collections in Dublin and around Ireland. And so the reason I chose kind of this group of artists was that they stand in, obviously, for much, there were lots of artists painting Dublin, but these 6 artists, they tell us a lot about different lives in the city. So, you see it in their political affiliations. Some will be maybe more unionist, some were nationalist. You have Kernoff, who's very much committed to communism and socialism. So they all tell us a little bit, or something a little bit different about Dublin in this period. They all paint or draw in different ways. They all approach the city differently in their art. And I suppose then that feeds into this wider context of the book. So I suppose the official date range of the book is 1886 to 1949. Now there's some leeway on either side of that, of course, but the reason I chose those dates, even just to mentally frame it for the reader, is it marks the defeat of the Third Home Rule Bill in 1886, which is a really important event kind of politically for Ireland. And then in 1949, you have the official, birth of the Republic, with the Republic of Ireland Act coming into being in April 1949. So they're 2 kind of legislative moments that I think bookend this period that we know so well from the recent decade of centenaries and the ongoing decade of centenaries, that where everything changes. You have social change, a huge political change, and really Dublin is at the heart of all of that, whether through literal kind of war on the streets, whether through kind of social change in terms of tenements and the building of the suburbs, but then also as the seat of the new Irish government as well. So they all kind of coalesce, I hope, quite nicely together.
Okay, and this kind of idea that they are all Dubliners. I wrote down a quote here that I took from it. This idea that we share space with them through their artwork, and I think I'm kind of curious how you saw choosing each of these artists against their kind of relationship to the city, and you might just kind of build that sense for us a little bit.
Yeah, so I think that sense that we're sharing a space with them, I kind of feel it myself. I've become so familiar with, the ins and outs of their lives and the way that they saw the city, that I do find myself walking around Dublin and I'll say, oh, that's a little bit like a Kernoff, or that's a Kernoff swan, I often say as I cycle down the canal on the way to work. But I think, city, and this is true of all cities, not just of Dublin, but cities are places where there are a lot of different people from different walks of life. You have a huge social range, and since cities evolved, people have been drawn to them. I myself was drawn to Dublin, well, not very far. I'm from Kildare, so not very far away. But for my 13th birthday, I asked could I go to Dublin for the day. So it's always had this appeal to me, and so I just wanted to capture that sense that in a way they live with us. We walk the same streets as they do, and some things have changed, but some things have really stayed the same. That core of the city, especially say if you walk down the river, between Bachelor's Walk and the Custom House, if you walk down the canal, you are kind of following in their footsteps. So I hope there's a sense in the book that we walk alongside these artists as well.
I'm kind of I'm hesitant to question what a Kernoff swan looks like.
When you so they always have these, just the way he paints swans, and there's lots of them in his canal paintings, but he captures this little twist of their neck in a way in the paintings that's almost like a caricature. But as you walk along, sometimes you just see it, and you can really see where he was getting this from in them. And once you'll see it all the time.
Okay, I will be going on Google after this conversation. One thing that when we caught up last week, one thing that you mentioned to me that I found kind of curious, I've been thinking about since, was this idea that Dublin as a city and how it's depicted in literature is something that is known very well both at home and internationally. Like, I think kind of Dublin as a brand has quite a strong kind of evocative sense in people's minds, and I kind of wonder how you think Dublin as a city is visualized in kind of an art context.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so there's a lot of parallels between literature and art in terms of how the city is represented, and I draw them out in the book a little bit. I mean, I think in every chapter there's kind of a literary connection, but it is true that we're more familiar with the city's writers, and I think we, generally speaking, as you say, we know them. Even if we haven't read Ulysses, we know about Ulysses, or the plays of Sean O'Casey, or even thinking maybe more recently, we've become more familiar with, say, with the Ranelagh of Maeve Brennan, or with Maeve Binchy and UCD and things. But they're really, when you start digging, there is just such a rich history of how the city is painted or printed or even photographed, which is not something I look at, but is there as well. We see an overlapping of themes. So I think things like just that sense of walking in the city, say in Dubliners, there's these great descriptions of street life, of the ships on the quays and the world beyond the city, and that's something that you see in Jack Yeats's sketchbooks. For example, Kernoff was friends with Patrick Kavanagh, and yet you have this lovely mix of, say, the Kernoff paintings of the canal and Kavanagh's poetic descriptions of the canal. So they're picking up on the same ideas of the city, the same ways of living in Dublin, but I think we just need to, or what I want to do is just redress the balance a little bit, so that we embrace the visual as much as we do the written word.
Okay, it's beautifully put, and I guess in embracing the visual, you might introduce us to one of the artists. I remember when we spoke about the 6 artists that you selected, you mentioned that Kernoff had a particularly important place in your own heart. So I thought that was an appropriate place to start.
Absolutely, yeah. So as I was talking about this earlier in the other lunch as well, Kernoff really is where it all began in 2008, so 12 years ago. And now I, just after my undergraduate degree, I did an internship in the National Gallery in the education department. And I was just kind of, wandering around going, God, this is brilliant. I can't believe I'm working here. It's fantastic. And Kernoff has a painting that's in the National Gallery's collection called Death. So it's a very morose title, but it's a really cheerful, jaunty painting in a lot of ways. It's shows this group of kind of 1920s, 30s kind of mods and like flappers being kind of led along by the Grim Reaper. So there's a whole art historical kind of thing going on there as well. But it's just extremely colourful, and it's really of a jazz age painting. I had never seen anything like this in my undergraduate degree when we looked at Irish art. And so that's when it started. I was like, who is Harry Kernoff and what is this painting? So he became the subject of my master's thesis the following year. And, he has this amazing archive split across 2 institutions, the National Library of Ireland and the National Gallery of Ireland. And so when he died in 1974, his sister was his executor, and she left his literary papers to the library and his artistic effects to the gallery. And yet, despite this richness, he hadn't really been written about in any great detail. And so just going through and piecing together his life and his work, was just this amazing experience. And I think what made it even more special was that for the time of my PhD, I actually lived on the same street as where he did, which was, a complete coincidence. There was a flat going, and, it was really central, on Stamer Street, which is just off Harrington Street. It's a brilliant city centre location. But I think as well, that's where that closeness came from. And then I suppose as I went on, finished the master's, and could see that he made this huge contribution in terms of the visualization of the city, but had no sense really of where he fit with his contemporaries. And so that's then when the other artists came on board, I guess, to really flesh him out. So I suppose maybe I'll talk a little bit about the others. Do you think?
Yeah, I'm very happy. I'd love to actually go through them kind of one by one, but it's it is amazing to actually hear that you quite literally walked streets that he walked on a day-to-day basis, and
it was very strange.
It's incredible to kind of look at the incredible piece of work that you've produced, and to think that some part of it sparked in that particular moment. It's charming, it's beautiful. But I'd love to know a little bit more about Kernoff himself. Like, I understand how he actually became an artist is an interesting story.
Yeah, it is. So he was born in London, and his parents were Russian migrants who came to London just at the end of the 19th century. Kernoff himself was born in 1900, and then they came as a family to Dublin in 1914, so just before the outbreak of the First World War. And his father was a cabinet maker and part of a very kind of quite large and healthy Jewish community living around the Portobello area at that time. And so Harry Kernoff, from really his teens, was apprenticed to his father in the cabinet making trade. But then slowly he starts to move away, I suppose, from the craft of cabinet making and into fine art. He starts classes, first of all, at the Kevin Street Technical School, so where DIT is today, DIT Kevin Street is today. Does well there and moves on to become an evening student at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, which is kind of tucked in between today, between Leinster House and the National Library, and it's the precursor to NCAD. So as an evening student there, he actually wins the Taylor Scholarship, which is a prize awarded by the RDS, and it's worth £50, which was, just a transformative amount, even though it sounds so little to us today. If you think, if you gave a student €50, you know, it wouldn't, but just at that time, that was a really meaningful amount. It allowed him to travel to Paris for a few weeks to see the art there. And then when he came back to Dublin, he could attend the Metropolitan School of Art as a full-time student. So he got his professional training and qualification as an artist. So his teachers would have been people like Sean Keating, you know, so part of that lineage of William Orpin and that kind of historic Irish training. And so then in around 1927, he finally stops kind of being a cabinet maker on the side and commits to a full-time career as an artist. And what I would say about him though is that, and maybe some listeners will know, that Kernoff is a beautiful worker of woodcut and producing these really graphic, strong black and white woodcuts. And I always just think that his skill with wood must come from that training with it as a medium younger in his life. So a really fascinating story.
That's amazing to see how, as you're saying, kind of, you know, his apprentice to his dad earlier would actually have gone on to inform his practices thereafter. Then, like, you kind of, in the book, you're talking about his relationship to Dublin and how he addresses it as a subject matter. This whole idea that he's living there, he's working there, but it's also his subject. And there kind of, is there any other pieces of information about his work that you might kind of share with us in that sense?
Sure. I think what's interesting about his work in particular is that it starts out in the 20s and 30s as being quite modernist, quite kind of veering on the abstract and quite arcane kind of at some time, these very strange subjects which are influenced by his political you know, opinions as well. And then it moves into just this really minute recording of his environs, and particularly in that quite close location. So Harcourt Street is really important to his kind of early cityscape paintings. So Harcourt Street Station, and the corner, I suppose now, kind of, if you were going around to the Bleeding Horse, and that, you know, had advertising wording, so he was really drawn to that. And then kind of going the other way, that stretch between Portobello Harbour down to Grand Canal Dock and then back up the river. This is an area that he's constantly walking and sketching. So in that group of materials that are in the National Gallery are all of these pencil sketches that he makes on the spot when he's out and about walking. He usually dates them and gives a time for when he sketches it. And then all over and you can see this if you go onto the National Gallery's online collection and just put in Kernoff, you'll see these. All of these little notes for color. So like GN or for green, or DGN for dark green. So he's making this record on the spot as he walks around, and then they come back to the studio with him, which is where he paints. And so then you often see as well that he might do a couple of versions of each one, you know, and I mean, artists do this all the time, that if it sells, if it's popular, he'll do another one. And say, for example, he has a painting of Wine Tavern Street, and there's one in the Hugh Lane that was purchased by the Friends of the National Collection. So obviously that's, you know, an important sale. It was going into a public collection. So he did a few more for private collections as well. So, but these sketches are the foundation for that.
Okay, and it's a savvy businessman by the sounds of it, which is
exactly. Yeah.
You've got to respect it, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then I guess kind of when you're talking about sketching, another person who was kind of regularly seen with pencil in hand and sketching was Jack B. Yeats. And you speak about how he was constantly sketching, sourcing, gathering materials to inform his work. You might just tell us a little bit about his approach to Dublin as a subject, but also his process of
working. Yeah. So I mean, it's similar to Kernoff, in that Yeats he's a sketcher. It's kind of the thing that he does daily as an artist. And again, in the National Gallery's collection, there are about 200 of these little pocket-sized sketchbooks, about this size, that he would have kept with him. And again, he's noting things down as he goes around the city. And so again, you get this really wonderful record of these little journeys that he's taking. And they can again be full of like innocuous details, like street markets, advertising, hoardings, maybe a quick sketch of a sculpture or something. But then suddenly they become very profound. So for example, there's a sketchbook from 1914 where he records being in Dublin immediately after the Bachelor's Walk events, when people have been killed there, and that little sketch of a gate of a flower lying against it, and that becomes a really important source for the painting Bachelor's Walk in Memory, which shows a flower seller laying her like a token at the point where someone had been killed. So he's used the sketchbook as source material for that painting, and you see that across his career, and often he'd go back to them 20, 30, 40 years later to pick something from the sketchbook. So particularly with Osborne, Yeats and Kernoff, the sketch is almost as important as the finished painting. Yeah.
The authenticity of that is incredible. The idea that, as you said, he's going back to source material from the lived experience of it. And like, I think Yeats is one of those people who, in the same way, we will casually mention Ulysses or Dubliners in conversation when talking about literature, I think his is a name that has crossed most of our lips kind of at some point throughout our lives. I'd love to know a little bit more about him as an individual, like what his background was and what motivated him to address Dublin as a subject.
Absolutely. So the name Yeats, it's so familiar to us, but they're just this, it goes without saying, this extraordinary family. Obviously you have John, the patriarch, the barrister turned artist and portrait painter, William, who we know as a writer, but he started out as an artist. He attended the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art before moving to art. Jack, we know as a painter. He was also an extremely prolific writer. He writes several novels, he writes books for children, he writes plays that are performed in the Peacock Theatre. And then you have Susan and Elizabeth Yeats as well. They're the boys' sisters who run the Coola Press and the Dunemer Guild, and who also just have this incredibly rich artistic output as well. So, they're kind of our important artistic family. And I think, Jack Yeats has so many different facets of his career. So there's his West of Ireland paintings, his circus paintings, his interest in, I suppose, a series of 3 or 4 paintings that become so deeply associated with the revolutionary period, including Bachelor's Walk. And then you have his later kind of romantic, almost abstract works as well, which are a little more challenging, but very rewarding as well. And kind of linked through that are these series of paintings of Dublin. So I think, like Bachelor's Walk, work that listeners might be familiar with is the Liffey Swim, which, certainly when I was in school, it was up on the wall, as a print. But then he's really drawn, I think, to these maybe kind of slightly shady aspects of city life as well. So we have paintings of kind of nightclubs, of kind of dark corners, of cabarets, of tram carriages where everyone is watching one another. So his city paintings can be quite neurotic as well. You get this sense of this quite, maybe at times quite lonely person going around trams at night and watching what's going on. And I think that's a side of Dublin we tend not to think of very, very much, is that just like, now there's this really strong nightlife in the city, there was in the 1920s and 30s as well. And Yeats shows us a little bit of that through his paintings.
I think we're all very much looking forward to the day when our nightlife returns to what it has the scope to be. But because this whole idea of nightlife and cabaret, and you mentioned circus there a little while ago, like these are common themes that many artists are addressing.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kernoff is really involved with the cabaret scene in the late 20s and 30s, doing kind of decorations for cabarets. Now, I think they're probably not quite as raucous as what we might see in, Berlin or something. But for Ireland, they're pretty they're pretty radical, if you like. And again, these I think aren't the things maybe that you learn about in your history books as well. But of course they're there. Again, it's just an inherent part of all of these people living in the city and wanting to get together to discuss ideas, to perform, to make art, whether that be music or painting or whatever. And that is a part of the book that I think is quite new and quite exciting as well.
And I think kind of a key part of the social life of a city is kind of this idea of, well, especially in Dublin, is this idea of the Dublin characters. And like I know there some of the more recent living characters of, I guess, the Dublin story, we've had great fun exploring in the museum over the last couple of years. But I wonder, do each of these artists kind of depict or represent different kind of street characters throughout the course of their work, or how do we see them manifest?
Yeah, there's a little bit. I think they probably appear more often as kind of tropes of characters rather than the characters themselves. And there's one exception. There is a Kernoff watercolor that's there's a man in it that's said to be Johnny Fortycoats, who was a man who lived in Dublin. I don't know if you've come across him in the museum, but who was living in the streets, but was a very recognizable figure. And he appears in the background of one or two Kernoff paintings, but he's kind of the only named one. Otherwise, what I mean by tropes is, say, these people in the city who you mightn't know by name, but who become a very characteristic part of Dublin streetscape. And again, for Yeats, that's the newspaper boys. So they're often, they're usually barefoot in quite ragged clothes. And you see this in Osborne as well. And I thought this was maybe kind of exaggerated. And I think Yeats does use the newspaper boy as almost like a symbol for us to think about themes like poverty, like work, and the role of children as well. But I was watching some of the IFI have a lot of newsreels from the 20s up, that you can watch online, and for things like Michael Collins' funeral and those big events of the 20s, and yet you see the newspaper boys, and there's a difference seeing them in film than in art. So they are a character that run right through from Osborne to Yeats and up to the middle of the century.
And now that you mention Osborne, like over the course of Walter Osborne's work, a lot of his you kind of speak about this idea that he offers kind of a social history into life in the city at the time, and I guess I'd love you to tell me a little bit about the themes and the subject matters that he would work with.
Yeah, so Osborne again is an interesting artist. He has a couple of kind of iconic paintings that people would know, especially those around Patrick Street. So he was living in Castlewood Avenue in Rathmines. That's where he grew up. His father was a painter as well, and so you can kind of imagine him walking down through Rathmines, maybe down the canal, and down to the area around St. Patrick's. And this was before the redevelopment later at the turn of the 19th century by Lord Ivy and Ardalin and the Guinness family. And so what he was kind of looking at there were the markets, which were open air markets, quite a dilapidated streetscape, and like a hard life for the people who were living and working there. And he just showed that with just, such sensitivity often in these beautiful oil paintings, showing the produce of the market, the people working there, but also not, I think, flinching away from, letting us know that these were places that were run down, they were dilapidated, they were muddy, probably quite smelly as well. You've got a lot of horses, and I'm thinking of Juliana Edelman's book on animals in the city, like to get that sensory experience of what it was like to be there. But he, I suppose, like Yeats, he's kind of drawn to this figure of the street child as well. And so they pop up in his paintings again, like just these little reminders of all of these children that were in the city. And we have in the Osborne archive is quite limited in terms of what we have remaining from him, but he does have a diary from 1892 where he names models. And so these were people who were sitting for his paintings, probably coming to his studio on Castlewood Avenue. And there are the names of children, because he painted children a lot. And these were children who were living in tenement areas. Some of them were from Italian migrant families. And, this is really the only named record we have of these children. And you can imagine, if you put yourself in their shoes, what it would be like to make the reverse journey. So whatever about Osborne coming from, relatively nice suburban Rathmines to Patrick Street, but then that reverse journey as well. And so there, you do just get these little insights into, again, the different lives in the city.
It's amazing. And like, in looking at Osborne, but also the other 5 artists that you've kind of spent so much time with, do we see kind of hints of what inward and outward migration in Ireland looked like as time went on? Because I'd imagine that's quite an interesting study.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably more to it than I have explored on this occasion. I think with Osborne, those little insights into just these names and areas, say like Chancery Lane, which was just off Patrick Street, that was known as an enclave of Italian migrants in Dublin. Obviously then with Kernoff as well, you have the Jewish community, and that is a very much a migrant community from the late 19th century, adding to an older existing Jewish community in the city. So you see how these, I suppose, paths of global migration, we think of migration from maybe Italy and Ireland to America, but not maybe Italy to Ireland, and those steps along the way. So there are traces of it, and I think there probably is more to discover as well. But also I think, and I kind of mentioned this at the outset, is that Yeats and Kernoff, I mean, both were born in London, and yet they are these they're these fantastic Dublin artists. Flora Mitchell was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and ends up in Ireland because her father gets a job at the Jameson distillery. And so I suppose, more so than showing kind of, I suppose, a very close look at migration, it just reminds us that there are always these fluxes in and out of the city. And we do just need to kind of, I think it's good to remember that as well.
No, it's beautiful, thank you. And I kind of, in looking at the scope of where your research went and your knowledge and kind of awareness, I'm so largely envious of. But I'm going to ask this question poorly, but over the course of your research, can you think of one story that just absolutely stole your mind or your heart and you became unashamedly obsessed with, and is kind of your key finding?
That's really hard, because there's so many like little stories. I do think that finding that Osborne diary with the names of these children, for whom there isn't even really a census record or anything for them, and just finding their names and thinking about their lives, it felt like a very small act of remembrance for them. And I think that was something that was very special to me. Another little one that I always kind of think very fondly of is, and I can't remember who wrote the letter, but there's a letter in the Kernoff papers in the National Library, which is from, I'm pretty sure it's from a man, I should have looked up who it was from, where he says that I was walking down Harcourt Street. So he's writing to Kernoff. He says, I was walking down Harcourt Street this morning and thinking about how it looked like a Kernoff painting. And then who should walk across the road but Harry Kernoff? And I just think this sense of, looking at the city and thinking, God, like, this is like a Kernoff painting. And then seeing him, and I think that for me really captured that sense again of living in their footsteps, and that they're part of the fabric, whether like literal or sensually or whatever, that they're part of the city. It's a very special thing to come across those little touches of human interaction.
I think I think in the little museum, they're the moments we pine for. It is those moments of real, genuine human interaction, as you say. And I think that been a particularly bizarre moment for that individual, but probably a long memory. It's so I think we'll ask you next about, I'm going to quote something I noted down here.
Okay.
The old magic of Dublin lies primarily in its colour, and it rests with us all to do what we can to build the delight for Dubliners to come.
Mm.
I'd love you to tell me a little bit about Flora Mitchell's.
I mean, she's a fascinating woman. She has this really interesting life. As I say, she's, you know, born in such a different world in Omaha, comes to Dublin because of her father's job with Jameson, the Jameson distillery. And again, so like the other artists, she trains in the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art. She spends some time abroad as part of her education. And I suppose comes up with that generation in the 1920s, like Kernoff, Maurice McGonagall, Estella Solomons, who have this opportunity to show Dublin and contribute to often to texts that are shaping the image of Dublin in those early years of the Free State. So things like the Civic Week handbooks, the Free State Handbook. There's this great collection of publications that use the work of these young artists to illustrate the city. So Mitchell is contributing to them. And then she actually marries a member of the Jameson family, William Jameson. And he is the master, a training master on the Royal Yacht Britannia. So this story is kind of wild. So they actually end up moving to Cowes on the Isle of Wight. And so we have this document in the National Library where she's talking about being on the royal yacht with the King and Queen, talking about Ireland and her life there. And so she stops working as an artist. I mean, she could be in a small way, but she's not exhibiting as an artist during that time. Then very sadly, her husband dies in 1939 and she comes back to Ireland. She's quiet still for the 1940s, but into the 1950s, that's when she starts to really contribute again as an artist and start new work and this new project of capturing vanishing Dublin. So I think Mitchell, you know, her work obviously goes outside of that 1949 cutoff, but she is part of that earlier generation. And she produces this wonderful series of watercolors that she then published in a book called Vanishing Dublin. You can still sometimes, they still come up at auction, and maybe there's one in the little museum, I'm not sure. And it's a beautiful book where again she talks about in the opening chapter of that, she talks about how we can sit down with this book and she'll take us through the city. So again, there is that running through all of this is that sense of being transported through the city. And what she's particularly concerned with is in the 1960s, the destruction of medieval and Georgian Dublin. So we know so much about this, you know, Wood Quay, the squares, you know, Mary Robinson and Maeve Binchy out as students, Marion Finucane out as student activists. And Mitchell obviously is, you know, older by that stage. And I think in that same article that you read that quote from, she talks about how she gets driven around the city. So rather than walking and sketching, she sits in the back of the car and sketches, which is maybe a bit more comfortable and weatherproof than the others. But what she really, I think, feels a lot of sadness about is how quickly things are changing, and that there isn't that moment to stop and think, you know, should we preserve this rather than start afresh? And I mean, of all of the themes in the book, I think that is something that we can completely identify with today. You know, even since I came to Dublin, parts of the city have changed so much and they continue to change. But I think that way that she says that this isn't just for our generation, it isn't just about us saying, oh, isn't it sad that that building is gone? It's about how we want the city to look for future generations as well, which I think is very touching as well. There's a great bit where she talks about the importance of red brick in Dublin, and what it always makes me think of is how kind of grey Grafton Street became when they took up the red brick and put down grey, and I think she would have hated that. Yeah, so we can see a lot of today's issues in her work.
Yeah, and actually, I think for an artist like her who questions today for the value of tomorrow, you'd be curious to see how she would interpret a walk through Dublin City today, like you said, on Grafton Street. It's
yeah.
like, I guess kind of not too far away from Grafton Street is obviously we've got the park there on Stephen's Green, and you talk about this idea of the park within Dublin and the impact and kind of its role within society. You might just talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So the park, specifically Stephen's Green, but also to some extent the Phoenix Park as well, pop up particularly in the work of Osborne and Kernoff as well. So Osborne came to Stephen's Green, he got a studio in Stephen's Green in, I think, the 1890s. And that was shortly after the park had been remodeled and opened to the public, again under the auspices of Lord Ardilan, and you'll see his statue still there today. And that's when the park really became what we know it as, this place for the public to gather and to, I think, have respite from the city centre. And I mean, that's still how we use it today. But very much in the 19th century, I mean, you know this, you get to look out at it from work. Very much in the 19th century, this idea of the park in the city, it was a philanthropic venture in a lot of ways. It was to create this green open space that was available to people, particularly those living in, I suppose, what were called like unhealthy or unsanitary parts of the city, where they could come and just kind of relax a little bit. But then also it was a space where if you were, quite upper class, you could come and you could walk and promenade and be seen as well. So the park became this space where all of these different social groups mixed and were in quite close proximity to each other. And maybe it's idealistic in a lot of ways to think that this would work, but I mean, parks do bring people together. And the same in the Phoenix Park, it's a place where you have activities like horse races, polo, you have the zoo, you have the People's Garden, and then you have these kind of wilder walks. So Kernoff in particular was really drawn to the little copses of silver birch around the outskirts of the park, and that view from the side of the Island Bridge side of the park over Kilmainham, which is what I look out of, from the other way, I look over towards that. So the park, for the Phoenix Park in particular, for Kernoff, was an escape from the city. And I mean, thinking of things that we can identify with, look at how important the parks have been this year to all of us, as from toddler to grandparent, and the parks have been somewhere where we can go and escape our houses. So I think Dublin is so lucky in its green spaces, and that does, we do see that in the art history of the city.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've probably all worn our runners and hiking boots more this year than we have probably in the decade prior. But,
absolutely.
But they are absolutely an invaluable asset at the middle of the city. But it's kind of one thing that, when going through the book and listening to you speaking this evening, one thing I'd be curious on your views of is kind of looking at context and looking at the lived experience of the citizens walking the streets alongside these artists. Like the Dublin that these artists are depicting, do you see them as rose tinted in any way? Are they ugly and authentic? How do they paint Dublin relative to how a local might describe it at the time?
I mean, it's a really great question, but it's one that's so difficult to answer. So, I think with any mediated depiction of a place, and whether that's an artist representation, whether it's a photograph we take today for Instagram, it never tells the full story. And, so Osborne's painting of a child from Chancery Lane can never tell us really that person's life. So I think always when we approach a painting of a place, and that doesn't matter whether it's Dublin or Achill or Roundstone or wherever, there is that sense that this is one person's interpretation of it. You do see there is a strand, both to an extent in artwork and also in more in written text, particularly kind of guidebooks or memoirs, this idea of old Dublin, where things were maybe slightly, it's very romanticized. It's particularly from the, I suppose, kind of late 18th century, maybe a little bit earlier, like with the Huguenot weavers and Weavers Square and that industrious sense of the city, and then how that's viewed after the Act of Union and how our view of how the Act of Union changes the city. There is a romanticization there, but it's more about, I think, unpicking the layers of how different generations see the city. And I think our interpretation will always be a little bit rose tinted, just to some extent. So I'm not sure that really answers your question, but it's a very complex kind of thing.
It probably is a 2-hour conversation in and of itself to even kind of scratch the surface. So it was probably an unfair question. This idea of kind of understanding and kind of reading a piece of art is something that I'm always particularly curious about. And like you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that, you know, a decade and a bit ago you did an internship in the National Gallery when you were just graduated. But I understand that you actually still to this day are on the panel of tour guides within the gallery, which sounds like an absolute treasure experience. But my understanding is that kind of one of the conversations that you'll have with guests from time to time will be actually how to sit with a painting and how to, you know, absorb it. And I wonder, where do those conversations normally go, and what are kind of the key pieces of advice that you'd have?
Yeah, I mean, it can be quite an intimidating thing if you're kind of coming to a gallery or a painting in any context for the first time. And I suppose the way I was trained as an art historian would be, you know, that close looking and that just taking a moment to see. And I mean, it can be a thing of walking through a gallery and just finding something you like, because we do have that instinct to say, that's not for me, this, like with this I really like. And so it's finding, in the first instance, you know, something that appeals to you, and then just, I suppose, taking a few minutes. If you're an art historian, you'll go from left to right. The paintings generally, you know, especially if you're looking at something like the Caravaggio Taking of Christ or something, you know, that is made in the classical manner to go from left to right, and you look at the faces, the expressions, the emotion that's being conveyed, and you know that can apply to a painting of a place. You scan the landscape, and you know, look for details of the brushwork where it's maybe more thinly or thickly applied, the way the light is falling. So it often is about just taking your time and taking a minute to stop and look. And you know, some days you'll see lots of things, and other days you won't because you'll be like, oh, I just don't have time for this. And I think that's fine, you know. And there will be, I think, times as well, maybe time of year, or depending what's going on in your own life, there are different themes that will appeal to you at different times, or different styles of painting as well. And I mean, yes, I've been on the guide panel now in the gallery for 12 years. They can't get rid of me. But it is something that I love doing, because I think, especially when you're writing about art, is that you spend so much time looking at your computer, and you're sitting on your own, and you're looking not even at actual paintings, you're looking at digital images of paintings, which can be great as well, but it's no replacement for the real thing. And so doing something like the tours in the gallery, you get to interact with the artwork, but also with the public as well. And you know, we were talking earlier about special moments in research, but a really special moment for me as a guide was when the Ireland's Favourite Painting competition was on. And, you know, we did a special tour of the works that were in the programme and being featured on TV and radio and everything. And we had so many people who would come in and say, I live, you know, down the road, but I've never come in here, because I didn't think it was somewhere I could come. And like that for me it's really sad, because these places are for everyone, and it's, as when you're working in an institution like that, it's breaking down that wall, breaking down that barrier, making sure people feel welcome and supported in discovering this, because you just need to be maybe given sometimes a few first steps, and then this whole world can open up for you. So what I would say is, if you're thinking, God, I don't really like going to galleries, to come in, go on a public tour when they start again, take a public tour, get the audio guide, and just take some time, and you know, it will come, hopefully.
Yeah, that I couldn't have put it better. And I know it's something, something we spend a huge amount of time thinking about in the museum as well. It's how do you invite someone who's never been in before to walk through the front door? And I think that often is the biggest first hurdle to overcome. But it's
and I think we all have something that we maybe feel that way about. Like, I'm not very good with cinema, and I often feel that way about like people who talk about film seriously. And I know it is just about taking that first step into it, or like classical music or something. But you know, if you can just, as you say, get over that first hurdle, it is this whole world. And sometimes it can be thinking of something that you really love in your own life, and saying, well, I'm going to find that. So, you know, if you really love Dublin, you could come and look at some paintings of Dublin, and it will introduce you to it. But it's finding that connection, I think, is a really important aspect of that journey.
Yeah, and I guess when you're talking about finding the personal connection, you were telling me about your own time in UCD, or sorry, not in UCD, in the National Gallery, and how working with, I think it was it Yeats's archive, that you got to see it through an entirely different light than how a researcher traditionally would. And I guess I'd be curious to tell us that story and how it informed your work.
Yeah, so I suppose when you approach something like an archive as a researcher, you're quite dependent on maybe the finding aid or materials that an archivist has put together. And, you know, they're always so thorough. An excellent archivist do an amazing job, but it's mediated through something else. So you're kind of reading someone's description of something and you're thinking, oh, is that what I think it is? Is that what I want to see? And often, you know, you just don't have time to take a chance on things, especially if they're not really relevant. But, you know, you're limited by time and scope often. And then I suppose working in the gallery and facilitating other researchers who needed to use the archive, suddenly I was going, God, I never knew this was here. And yet that's so relevant to my research, and just doing that kind of, you know, daily kind of interaction, whether it be taking material out for other researchers, taking things out for an exhibition, for conservation, just doing a general kind of tidy up. And you see a collection in a completely different way. And I'm sure, you know, the curators in the museum will see it very differently to a member of the public coming in. So having the opportunity to see something from both sides can just open up whole new avenues of research as well.
And I guess kind of, I'm mindful that there is two artists that we haven't really got to speak too much about, and I just don't want to miss my opportunity. When we're talking about Estella Solomons, I was fascinated to learn that there was a time in which you didn't have the right to sketch in the city and to draw in the city without a permit. I'd love you to tell me about her work and I guess the world she was living in.
So so Estella Solomons, again, she's not just they're all fascinating. I couldn't I know I sound like a broken record saying they're a fascinating artist, but they really all are. So Solomons, again, she grows up on Waterloo Road and similar kind of training to the others. What's really interesting about her is that she is a painter, and she does some wonderful paintings of her studio on Pearse Street or Brunswick Street as it was then, and kind of reflections on the city, very much in the tradition of Osborne, in fact. But she turns to etching as well as a medium, part of the etching revival that we see in the late 19th and early 20th century. And she's immediately from, say, the mid-1910s, drawn to the city as a subject, particularly little lanes and courts and highways and byways. But after the beginning of the First World War, there is a sense that you had to have a permit to draw certain parts of the city and coastline in case you were, you know, making notes of enemy troops or ship movements and this kind of thing. So it's part of a legislative thing. So if you were an artist in the city at that time, you had to apply to the Dublin Metropolitan Police for a permit to sketch, which Solomons did. And in her papers in Trinity, you see the response from the police. She is vouched for by her teacher at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art. And she's given permission, I think, to paint or to sketch in the parks, but not on the river. But so then she ends up getting caught by a policeman sketching on Wellington Quay. And so there's also in her archive the letter from the police saying, look, you were given a permit to paint here, but you were caught here. So she kind of, nothing happens, but she gets a rap on the knuckles about it. So this would have applied to artists working, Sean Keating has to apply for a permit to paint the coastline as well. I had a really wonderful conversation with someone in the Garda Museum about what archives they have, and unfortunately they don't have the registers from that time that would maybe give us a full listing of who applied for permits, who were granted permits. I mean, maybe one day they'll turn up. So we're dependent on finding these in artists' archives, and Solomon's and Keating are the only ones I know of at the moment, but I'm sure there are others out there.
That's fascinating that you're kind of, it is a puzzle to kind of pull the information together as you can. And I see a question coming through, but I'm going to ask you to take us to the final artist before I ask you the ultimate mean question that of course has to be asked. So, Rose Barton is the only artist I don't think we've yet spoken about. Tell me a little bit about her own background and I guess the influence that that's had on her work.
Yeah, so Barton, I suppose, in contrast to some of the other artists, Barton comes from a very kind of well-to-do upper class family who are very much embedded in the kind of vice-regal aristocratic circles in Dublin. Her father is a barrister and he's advising the British administration in Ireland. Her mother is a socialite. So they're, and Barton and her sister, they're presented at court to the Lord Lieutenant, so that's the world that they're living in, which really none of the others are. And I suppose it starts out, her work, I think maybe sometimes isn't taken seriously because of course we would expect any young woman growing up in that world to be able to paint. It's just part of their education. But with Barton, she does become a professional artist. She's selling her work and she's making money from her work and she's producing it for a market. But I think that her life is obviously reflected in the subjects that she chooses, as it is with all of the other artists. So for example, with Barton, we really see that she's drawn to Dublin Castle as a subject and showing the rituals of Dublin Castle. So there's a very well-known watercolour called Going to the Levee. So the Levee was a kind of mid-morning assembly hosted by the Viceroy, and we see the carriages going into that. She shows us the changing of the guard, which happened on St. Patrick's Day. So these rituals are, a part of Dublin life that we tend not to engage with very much. I think because it represents a very different type of political life, but that is part of the city's history. And so I thought it was important that through Barton that was represented in the book as well, because it is important to see it as well.
And because I think kind of one thing that's coming through very clearly to me from what you've been saying is this idea of diversity and including different perspectives and different voices and kind of perspectives through the works that you were choosing, the artists you were choosing to research. And when we're looking at this idea of painting Dublin, I wonder, having spent so much time with each of these artists, the works that they've produced and their own individual, the people they've met, their influences, has there been kind of one core trait or essence to Dublin, like to Dublin's identity, that kind of has rang true throughout each artist?
I think the idea of change is something that runs through a lot of their work, of capturing even small or big changes in the city. And I think that does remind us that there's very little static in a city. Things constantly evolve and change, and depending on your background, they might affect you a lot or they might not touch your life at all. And I mean, these artists, they're only diverse really in the sense that they maybe come from different class backgrounds. I mean, there's no we're not talking about kind of racial diversity. Here it's diversity in terms of class and maybe political leanings as well. So it's, you know, there's still probably, I think, a lot more to find out about them, but I think it's good to remind ourselves that there isn't one Dublin story. And I think that, you know, that's something that the museum does. It shows us all of the different stories of the city, but here we see it through these artists' works as well.
It's wonderful, and it's some of the themes you've touched on this evening are actually things that we've been working on ourselves this year while museums been closed. Just some of the research and curatorial curation projects we're working on. So it's exciting to hear and to kind of, I guess, learn from you. And I guess I've got one more question that I see one of our attendees, Mairead, has written in, and I think it would be remiss not to ask you, which of these artists ultimately has your heart, if you had to?
That's such an impossible question. I think obviously because Kernoff is where it all started, and that is it's a huge part. It is a huge part of it. You know, I wouldn't have gotten here today without seeing that painting all those years ago, and I think the richness of what is in his archive kind of propelled me a lot along the way. But there are parts of each of the artists that I love, and if I could sit down with them for even 5 minutes just to ask them a question. I mean, when you think of like someone like Estella Solomons being, you know, in the heart of the city and meeting with all of these really interesting people, I would love to hear her version of that. And but particularly maybe someone like Barton, the importance of sitting down with her, because there is no archive for her. There's her paintings and her sketches. We have no letters, we have no diaries. So, you know, in different ways, I think, yes, Kernoff is at the heart of it, but it's like choosing your favorite child. I don't think I could give an absolute answer to that.
That was very gracefully responded to in that case. Thank you. So I think kind of today being the launch of your book, Painting Dublin 1886 to 1949, Visualising A Changing City. To those who are with us this evening, if you feel so inclined to go and read it, which I know is, you've made some of my last minute Christmas shopping very easy. Kathryn has very, very kindly given me a code. So using the code painting50, the book is available from Kathryn's website with a 50%, like a very generous discount off it. So to anyone who
I can pop that in, I can pop a link maybe in the chat so that people have it as well. So there's the website, and then the code is paint. Okay, so if you, it's through the Manchester University Press website, and if you put in the code painting 50 at checkout, that will give you 50% off, and that code will be valid until the 24th of December. So even if you think you'd like it as a post-Christmas read, you have a little bit of time, and of course with the post being delayed and everything at the moment, it might be a January read for you. But yes, obviously no, this isn't a hard sell, but it's there if you want to use it.
And obviously launching and publishing a book in this year, I think, has probably not gone exactly the way you've planned it, but you know, it's been truly such a pleasure having you here this evening, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone here in just saying congratulations. It's definitely a milestone to celebrate. It's a beautiful, beautiful publication. I've thoroughly enjoyed spending time with it. So that's unfortunately it for this evening. So to everyone who's joined us, thank you for being here for another 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. And to Kathryn Milligan, thank you genuinely so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Happy Christmas.
You too.